Hey guys, how's it going? Holden here from Podtaki from Holden Reviews as well. And today with me on Humcast, I have Wexter
Hey.
from Humcast. I've got Heavenly from Hummingbird.
Hello.
And 42 Gamer, also known as Brett.
Hey, what's up?
And today we're going to be talking about what we've been watching recently in regards to this 2015 anime season, or 2014 winter, depending on what kind of frame of reference you're talking about. So, recently I had a talk with Heavenly, and he said that he'd been watching a lot from this season. How much have you been watching, just to get a frame of reference?
I think about 5 series. I dropped a few in the earlier phases, but I think 5 is what I'm going at right now actively.
It's not too bad.
A few of them will get picked. Yeah, a few of them will get picked up again when they're done airing. Like Absolute Duo, I know you're watching that one. That'll get picked up again when it's finished.
I think it's really weird how this season, right, has it has 2 shows. Actually, it has what was it? I think it's just 2. It has 3. Yes, so what was it? It was 3. It was a trifecta, and this is this trifecta of shows that all feel the exact same. And that's the trifecta I'm talking about. Is Absolute Duo, Unlimited Fafnir, and World Break. All 3 shows are they're so interchangeable in every way. It's really weird. I haven't seen a kind of trifecta like this since the Weird Girlfriend trifecta season, where it was Song Korea, Dust Made Amnesia, and Nazuno Kana Joe X, and Song Korea. Yeah, and it's just really odd to see all this come back. Have you guys seen though anything from this season though in regards to what's airing, including but not limited to stuff like Death Parade and whatnot?
I feel really guilty because after last season where I dropped about 4 shows, I was getting very picky this time. So I only picked up a few shows that were continuing from previous seasons, and there was a few shows as well. I'm watching Gundam no Gino Reconquista.
Yes.
Watching Death Parade, Parasite, Kuroko no Basket 3, and I really want to start Seinai Heroine no Sodata Kata.
Yeah, man, Saikana for short. It's pretty great.
Oh man, I had a suspicion it was gonna be great because I kind of predicted it was probably gonna be the sleeper hit. It's the sleeper hit. I haven't started watching yet, and I feel extremely guilty because I recommended it to about 5 or 10 people to say, just watch this at the start of the season.
It's really good. I really enjoy it. None of you guys have seen it, have you?
No.
Okay, so for you, my suggestion to you guys and anyone else interested, there is an episode 00, which came out before the series, a week before, and it's an OVA kind of thing that takes place 6 months after the end of the series. And it really sets up this kind of false pretense about the show and its fan service and everything. I really recommend not watching it and just going directly into episode 1 of the original series that's airing right now, and skipping the OVA entirely until the end, because the contrast is so different. It's so diametrically opposed to what the show actually is that I could see the OVA thing kind of turning away a lot of people, and for no other reason than it's really I don't know. I think the word I would use is conformist. It's very much what you'd expect modern fan service to be and stuff. Whereas the show itself has none, which is really a stark contrast considering you watch episode 00 and then go into the series, and it just feels like a completely different show entirely. Which is why I really recommend not watching it until the end. That, and for the reason that the OVA takes place 6 months after the end. So if you watch it, you already know what's going to happen. There's a character in the OVA who was introduced as a cousin, who they still haven't introduced in the show, and it's on episode 7 is what I'm on right now. So I'm just waiting for her to arrive. But if you hadn't watched the OVA, I wouldn't have this false sense of anticipation towards her arrival in the series.
Right, you see, I've actually seen the OVA. That's the first episode I watched, was the episode.
Yeah, the one with the hot spring, right?
Yeah, it was the hot spring episode. Yeah, that's the one I watched, and it was kind of my turn-off to Saikono. I thought it was going to be a bit different. I mean, I figured there would be some fan service, but it was the OVA, or the episode 00, or whatever you want to call it, was nothing but fan service. I was kind of confused as to where the plot was. It was an unusual for what I thought was a first episode.
No, yeah, I definitely agree. It really is. And I think what's weird is that it's such a false pretense as to what the show really is. And I think that's really odd. As far as first episodes go, I think that opens like a much broader topic that we can talk about. Is like for this season specifically, has there been any first episodes to anyone that have really stuck out as something that maybe you didn't want to watch because of the first episode or wanted to watch because of it? It's just an interesting topic considering it's of course the first thing we see in an anime, and it's interesting to see how they use that kind of thing to either lure you in or deter you. Because like last season, or just a couple months back when Tokyo Ghoul aired, it was a huge thing sending waves because the first episode was so amazing. And I still really like the series. And same story with like stuff like Zankyo no Terror or Terror in Resonance, where its first episode was it set the expectations so high that people were just like really questioning whether it was possible to sustain such high expectations throughout the narrative itself. But I direct this question now, to you guys. So what do you guys think?
Well, I mean, I think the first episode is also a very important way to get the audience into the mood of a show. And I find sometimes it can be a bit conflicting. Like, the first episode to Gundam Reconquista no G, it starts off very light, almost fluffy, almost like almost like a childlike show. But as it gets deeper and deeper in, it's getting darker and darker in. I mean, it's a weird contrast to where the series is right now to how it started. It's almost as if Tomino wasn't quite sure where he wanted to take it. It was a little weird.
Yeah, I think Tomino just taking the helm of it just as a whole is kind of really interesting, considering this is his first work since 1999 when he worked on Turn A Gundam. Mm-hmm. And so it's really interesting to see him come back just 1.5 decades later, trying to attempt to reestablish himself in the modern anime world. And to questionable avail. It's interesting how divided people are on Reconquista NG, because it's so polarizing towards its audience, it seems. There's a lot of people that love it, and there's just a huge faction of people that also just hate it. It's very interesting to see that dichotomy and how it works.
Like, I personally like it because it kind of reminds me of a 0079 and, to a lesser extent, Turn A, where it's a more of a lighter Gundam than some of the other UC entries. But I can see why it could also be a turnoff because it's got more childlike humor, just like those two shows as well. Because you could go back and watch 0079 and go, oh, wow, that was immature. That wasn't funny at all. And it's weird. It's a weird feeling. I love the design of the G self. I love the mech designs, but I'm just not entirely sure how I feel about the show. It's weird. It's a weird feeling I've got.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that it is polarizing. I think it's really important to get across. But I think what's interesting about it, like Reconquista NG, is I think it was part of it is that I think it was almost set up with almost unrealistic expectations just from the get-go. I think that a big part of that was, of course, Tomino coming back, but also just looking at just the very broad stroke idea that the last UC entry was Unicorn. Like, how do you live up to something like Unicorn, right? Because Unicorn was this like tremendous, 5-year project that just blew people away. Like, how does Gundam come back from that? And more importantly, I think that a really important thing to mention, of course, that I think you'll understand as well, Wexter, is the idea that its direct correlation with the UC timeline instantly makes it much more, like, you have to judge it in a completely different light than anything else. Because being affiliated with the UC timeline puts an entirely, just immediately, just by being a part of the Universal Century, it puts this very small filter on it, where it's like, you have to look at it through this, viewpoint now.
Yeah, and I know exactly how you feel about it, because the UC timeline, I don't think it's perfect. Like, it's got a few flaws in it, some of which being Victory Gundam is a little odd, Double Zeta Gundam is really okay for the first half, and the second half's pretty good. And I mean, I love UC. I made a chart on how to watch UC Gundams, but I mean, it's one of those things is that it's weird because you have to judge Reconquista against the standards of Zeta Gundam. You have to judge it against the original Char's Counterattack, Unicorn, and Gundam The Origin, which just came out, which I hear is amazing. Haven't had a chance to sit down with it yet. And, I mean, it's going to feel weird. This is going to feel a lot like later entry UCs, like F91 Victory, where it's going to have its dedicated fans, but it's not going to really be talked about. Probably when it's finished airing, people are just going to go like, yeah, G-Reco, it was okay.
I can definitely see that being the case. But to kind of separate this question from the other ones, I think that So like, what else have you guys been watching? Because I've been watching everything, so I wouldn't want to talk about that. But I want to talk about like, what have you guys been watching? Not necessarily just in general, like in anything. That you would like to touch base on at this moment?
I've been watching Psycho-Pass recently.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
So here's a question for you. Have you been watching the dubbed version of it or the sub version of it?
I've been watching the dub of it.
Okay, yeah, because that's my friend Garant, Giga, he watched it dubbed as well, and he said he loved it dubbed.
Yeah, the dub is really good.
Yeah, he really liked it. What do you think of the show so far? Because this is just, you haven't seen it before, I assume.
No, I haven't seen it before. I'm about 17 episodes in, and I'm really liking it so far. I really like kind of like the world that it's built around like this, around like the civil system and kind of how people are living with that.
I think it's really interesting show for another mechanic that I just loved about it, which was the idea that most of the investigators, their tools, their dogs basically, are the idea that they are latent criminals themselves and can at any point be executed if they get out of line. And I think that the kind of interesting relationship between people like Koga and everyone else, it's really interesting because it's just like, he is a bad guy in his past, so they can kill him if they need to.
Like, I mean, when you look at the first episode of Psycho-Pass and you first got introduced to the enforcers, it was just overall a really well-directed scene. They almost seemed like vicious animals being let out of a cage. It was just really great direction with the way the shadows kind of laid on the characters. It was pretty great. Like, that is like one of these scenes I remember the most out of the entire series. Just because you really did get a sense of, wow, these people mean business. They are dangerous. They're something else entirely from the characters we've just been introduced to.
I think, yeah, just even just comparing them to, for instance, the people within the office, a part of the civil service, it's interesting because they're so different, you know? They have such more defining characteristics, and I think a big part of that is, of course, due to the fact that they were from, like, pre-production standpoint, right? They were like, this is the cast, make this guy like coffee a lot, like, make this guy like books, make this person have a fake hand, like, there was, of course, the very key characteristics that went into each individual, but just, I think it's really interesting seeing how, like, you have this predisposition against them, where you're like, these are latent criminals, but it's kind of, the whole reason that's interesting is because it has to rebuild your trust of them as characters instead of criminals. And I think that was probably my favorite part about Psycho-Pass, was the idea of learning to have this trust towards people like Koga and everything, even though they have, like, really unconventional and, like, very vicious ways of obtaining goals, they still get results nonetheless.
I do agree with you that it's about building the relationship between someone who you believe to be a criminal and trying to trust them. But at the same time, I feel like they didn't bring enough of the criminal perspective into play. For instance, we know that they're criminals, but we don't really feel like they're criminals. There's nothing that really indicates that. That's true. Like, if they really built in this system of, you know, these are the guys that are behind the jail cell of the people you see in the news every day, you want nothing to do with them, I felt like it could have been way more interesting in building a character relationship from viewer to, you know, protagonist.
I mean, Heavenly, they think they tried to do this a bit more of Season 2. I'm not going to spoil anything for Season 2 because Brent isn't there yet, and I'm sure a few people haven't seen it yet. But I mean, I think they tried that more in Season 2, and they kind of had semi-mixed results on it. But in Season 1, yeah, I definitely got the same feeling. But at the same time, you have to remember, some of these people were latent criminals that were detected as latent criminals when they were children. There was one character in particular who pointed out that I've never had a real life. I've always been in a jail cell since I was like 5 years old.
I think, yeah, that's true. I think what's really interesting, me personally, as far as the franchise goes, despite anyone's thoughts on the second season, I'm really interested to see the film, of course, because I think it's just, I don't know, it looks so promising to me. And I think it's really interesting seeing IG kind of do this much with Psycho-Pass. The last time we saw IG do something like this much with something was like Ghost in the Shell. Like, it was the last time that they were like, this is a franchise, we are going to, like, do things with this. And That said, of course, we're getting the new standalone complex thing, which is the Arise counterpart. So it's a series version. If for anyone who doesn't know, there was 4 film releases of this thing called Ghost in the Shell Arise, which is a new reimagining of the Ghost in the Shell franchise, and they are now making a series based upon the events of Arise, not Ghost in the Shell standalone complex. But it is a series, and it's Ghost in the Shell, so that's the only correlation to standalone complex. But it's interesting seeing IG kind of take this as a profitable IP and not just one of those one-off shows that they've so frequently done recently, where they're like, it's all right.
Yeah, the last time I think IG really got me excited over a franchise kind of like this, where they had movies and a TV series, was Breakblade.
That's true. Wow, yeah.
And I was extremely disappointed to not hear there's a second season coming out, because apparently there's a lot left of the manga that has not been animated. And on one level, I mean, Breakblade's pretty great, but I want more of it. And it makes me really excited for people who do love Psycho-Pass. I love Psycho-Pass, that they are getting this treatment, because it is a great show, and it's a high recommendation.
Yeah, it's a really cool show. I remember watching it back when it came out years ago, and there was just it was something that like it was the show that like really was like, this is IG being themselves again. Because up until that point, I think the biggest thing was like IG was really kind of just doing all this kind of adaptations and stuff, which weren't bad, because I mean some of the results of that were stuff like Usagi Drop, but it was interesting to finally see IG go into their clear element, which is of course sci-fi and high technological stuff like that, like stuff like Guilty Crown and whatnot, where it's all futuristic dystopian. But yeah, that's something that
it'd be interesting to see how they take it. I mean, I'm gonna jump back to the Psycho-Pass movie,
sure.
But one thing that I felt was left unadventured in the Psycho-Pass universe, and I haven't seen season 2, so it may touch up on it, is the world outside of the city. Like, they mention it, I think that it's kind of like a utopia situation, very vaguely, but they don't talk about the world outside of the city. What's going on elsewhere? That's things I want to see.
Yeah, and I can kind of agree with that. I think the world outside is something that really has not been explored yet. And it seems like from the trailers that we have seen so far, it seems like it's a story about illegal immigrants and terrorists are kind of invading the city. And that's kind of the idea that I'm getting from what I've seen so far. And it looks interesting. It looks extremely interesting.
Right. I mean, there's this whole world out there, like, just unexplored, untouched, unmentioned, that has so much potential to be explored upon.
It just isn't, yeah. It's limited to the confines of the walls it's set up, which is often the problem with having a setting be a very central key focal point, and not, especially if a city is in a fictitious world, because then you run into this, the dilemma of, well, what is the rest of this world like? Because it's clearly not like Earth, and I want to know more about this world rather than just this exact location. Because I remember that was like a big thing with like that I loved about stuff like Eureka 7, was that it felt like you were just exploring this entirely new world. It didn't feel like you were just in Bell Forest the entire time. And so that happens a lot with like when you've got like those made up worlds. That's one aspect that I really loved about Suisei Gargantia. Was it felt like you were just going around and not, the key point wasn't necessarily, it helped that the world was flooded, but it didn't necessarily feel like it was like, this landmass is going to be the focal point for the entire show, and it's not Earth, but we don't know what it is, and that's just too bad. Like, I think that was like my biggest complaint with one of my things I always remember thinking when I was watching Attack on Titan was like, the idea is as cliche as it sounds, it's like, what is beyond the wall? Because although we venture outside of it like briefly, it was the idea that like what is it really like? Like we get it, the idea of the Survey Corps, but it's for a company named after surveillance, we didn't really get to see much outside of these walls. And so something that I always thought was really interesting was because it was like this world was like clearly it was like, we don't know if this is Earth or not. Like, what country is this? It might be Hungary. It might be Russia. Like, we don't know.
Yeah, like Like, I mean, one thing I enjoyed about Attack on Titan was definitely the interior parts of the city. I found that very interesting, how it had the kind of the class struggle in there. But when they got outside of the wall, it was a major disappointment. When, there's minor spoilers here, it's just they didn't get that far outside of the wall before they had to turn around back.
Yeah.
It was just like, we only got like a taste, really, of the outside, but at the same time, it was just like forests, plains. There wasn't really much architecture that was different because they were only in like another ring of the wall itself.
It's really funny because like to me it felt like whenever you leave a video game, how they have this open sandbox and outside of where they want you to go, it's just repeated patterns of just random terrain. It's like in for instance in the Grand Theft Auto series, you could fly infinitely in any direction, but it's just water. Like you'll never hit a wall, but you'll never find anything. And that's kind of like what it felt like. It was just like generic terrain. It was like here's the trees, here's the fields, there's the Titans. Go back home. Like that was it. Like it's all we got.
Yeah. One thing we definitely didn't see is we didn't see any proof of civilization, which is extremely disappointing.
That's true.
We saw the wall. We know the wall exists. So did they just go out in the middle of nowhere, just nothing, just like a whole bunch of people just went somewhere and built the wall? Like, where's the remnants of the rest of the societies that exist or should exist around them? Like, okay, they're far offshore.
Yeah.
But come on, there's got to be something somewhere.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting point because it's like we're never given a proper time frame either, right? We don't know if this is like because there's an interesting theory that I heard from my friend who's like, I think it's just like this dystopian future. And there's nothing to, like, really prove that wrong. Like, that's what's so weird. Like, they have the technology to, like, support that it is, like, this oddly futuristic setting, but we've just regressed tremendously in forms of, like, our dynamics and, like, materialistic possessions and everything. Because of 3D maneuver gear, like, what the fuck is this? Like, are you kidding me? Like,
yeah.
How is this not the future, is what he said.
Yeah, and I mean... And despite Attack on Titan being, I think it was an overall pretty great show with a kind of okay ending. One thing that I really enjoyed about the show was just the technology looked old, but it didn't look out of place. It looked very steampunk, and it kind of fit the medieval Victorian kind of aesthetic they were going for, and that's something I really enjoyed. I liked the fact that they weren't pulling out, like, laser cannons or anything like that to... So
it wasn't a comic of kills, what you're saying?
I'm disappointed with that anime. The manga was pretty good. Anime, I'm very conflicted on that. Very conflicted.
I remember a distinct moment in the anime, wherever it has the girl who has the laser that's directly linked to, like, her embarrassment and emotions and shit. And it's a flat out, like, hardcore railgun. Oh, God. And it's like everyone's using swords and she says this railgun. And I'm like, what the fuck is this? Like... Why does she have does nobody realize that she has a particle, like, accelerator? Like, is this real life? Like,
oh my god. And I mean, this is something I discovered after the show was finished, but it actually is the same writing team that wrote the manga as who wrote Magikoi. I'm like, that makes a lot of sense why this is completely ridiculous.
It's true.
It makes perfect sense now. Everything makes sense. But
it's always funny when you see shit like that, though, because I mean, like in Naruto too, you know, you see like the classic, like they have Bluetooth headsets, and it's like we're still using knives, like. It's like we have cable television, can't invent guns, like.
I mean, I will defend Akame ga Kill on certain levels. Aesthetically, it was a pretty great looking show. I loved the animation on it. I loved the music. It was pretty great, and the story was. It was. Episode 17. That's all I'm gonna say. Just at episode 17, I just saw like this entire downward spiral into whatever that was. Something. It was a something. It kind of reminds me of Blue Exorcist to a degree, where it was pretty good.
Oh my god. Whereas Blue Exorcist is such like... It's like that thing that always just comes back, and I'm just like, God damn it, I've watched that show. And I always... Because, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. You're talking about, like, the point where it clearly just kind of, like, meanders into... And then it just eventually ends.
Yeah, and I mean, a Blue Exorcist is, I think, the perfect analog for kind of Akame ga Kill, to where it was this very interesting world, interesting fighting styles. Everything was kind of cool and fascinating, really well animated show, but it got to a certain point where there's these strange plot leaps and character motivations where you're just going, this doesn't make sense. Like, this doesn't make sense with the world you've built so far.
It's always interesting coming back to, like, that show specifically, because that show was so, like, it was so clear that they were like, we want to make so much of this, and it's always, like, really odd coming back to it and just being like, we didn't, like... I still do this. I have it, actually. I think, yeah, I do have it. I own it right now, even. But I've never watched it, which is the Blue Exorcist film. I'm saving that for when I'm just like, I want to rewatch the series. I'm just like, no, don't waste your time, but watch this movie instead. Because it's one of those rare things, right, where it's like, it was like a successful enough IP, but it just didn't have what it took to make more.
I mean, I've read ahead in the manga. I think I've read up to volume 9 or 10. It was something like that. I think I stopped collecting it because it just got to a point where I was just kind of done with it. I was just like, I don't know. I'm kind of done, and it's okay. And unfortunately, that happens to me a lot when I watch shonen, which is why I've completely stopped watching ridiculously long-running series because I get to a I do not care point anymore.
I think that's a pretty common trait, though, in most people.
Probably is.
I think what's interesting is, like, we're finally seeing... It's always weird, kind of, right? How we're seeing not the decline in shonen, but it's, like, it's becoming more and more... I don't even know. They're becoming a lot shorter. For instance, like this season, right, we have Assassin Classroom, or Ankyutsu no Kyokushi. And the thing about Ansatsu Koshitsu is that it's, like... It's very clear it's a shonen. You're like, it makes Shonen Jump references. It's like, oh, Dragon Ball Z, Bleach, Naruto, One Piece, and stuff, right? And it has all that there. And so it's like, okay, this is a Shonen Jump series, kind of like Gintama, where you're like, oh, it's joking about the series is that it's running alongside in the same publication. But you know that this show's only going to be 25 episodes. And I think that's always really interesting, is seeing all these shonens that are just like, we're going to stop. Another example being like Seven Deadly Sins and Natsu no Taizai, where it's like, we're going to stop. And stuff like even Tokyo Ghoul, where it's like, we're going to stop. Like, there is no, like, clear shonen other than, I think, the new season of Fairy Tail that's like, we're gonna keep going. Like,
I mean, on some level, sometimes I think the reason why certain shonen that last longer than others, like Bakuman, lasted longer than it did, is because it was more original, it was different. I think we're getting to the point that viewers are starting to see the repeating trends where they're like, it's just Dragon Ball again, but this time they're ninjas, or it's just Naruto again, but this time they're kind of like ghost samurais, or this time it's like Bleach, but this time they're actual exorcists that exorcise demons. I think people are starting to notice that Battle Shonen in particular is just repeating the same kind of ideas over and over again, and there's no real originality to it outside of its setting and maybe a few of its characters.
I think that's really... I think that holds a lot of weight as far as, like, talking about what they're happening, right? Because I remember when I started watching anime, shonens were the definitive entry-level material that you got into anime with. And not only that, they were the most predominant anime by and large. And it's really interesting seeing, like, kind of more or less their decline. There's still very shonen series, of course, but there's no shonen battle series, I guess is the best way of putting it, right? There's still, of course, sports series is a very big thing that's made a huge resurgence recently. But it's always kind of been there, but it's never at quite the forefront it is now with stuff like Haikyuu and Kuroko no Basuke and everything, where it's made this huge resurgence that I never would have predicted, because I always thought, like, Slam Dunk was just a show that people watched and were, like, okay with, but never loved.
I mean, what I'm also noticing is we are getting less historical battle shonen that are actually historical. Rurouni Kenshin being a good example of it, is that it was a shonen. Like, if you actually go watch the show, it is shonen, but it feels so different from Dragon Ball, Naruto, and all that, and it was a relatively long-running series. I think the reason why people really gravitated to it, because it was just so different. The main character has an oath not to kill, and it's kind of cool. It's this cool kind of idea, and it makes sense for the character as well. It's not, oh, we can't have him kill people because kids are not going to like that. Or in Naruto's case, what I started noticing is he was talking the villains out of doing their evil plans of evil.
Yeah, and I think that's that's just kind of a reoccurring trend in today's, anime. I think is really interesting. Like, as far as that goes, I think another interesting topic to, like, talk about then, I guess, with the current anime is the idea of, like the predominant audiences that that the demographic is becoming very mixed, right? I think it's very interesting that we're finally seeing diversification in the audience. It's not, for, like, the first time in a long time, I feel like it's not just all otaku bait stuff. Like, it's just not. Which is rare, because I used to think it was. Like, well, I remember distinctly, like, last year, some seasons, I was like, it's a good thing I like anime, or I wouldn't watch any of this. Like, because this all just looks like just nonsense. But now you have all this new stuff that's just coming out that's just different. One show that I want to talk about that I just want to mention is just Junketsu no Mario, or Maria, the Virgin Mary Maria? No, the Virgin Maria. Virgin Witch Maria, that's what it is. And just a fantastic show by IG. I love it. It's a show about basically keeping your virginity. Because if you lose your virginity, you lose the ability to use witchcraft, because witchcraft is correlated with innocence. Because it's the idea that the Virgin Mary herself was divine because of her virginity, and the idea that once Mary had sex, she was of course condemned to hell. So it's really amazing that not only that, but the show explicitly takes place in France. Everything's in French. They're speaking in Japanese, but they say that they're in France and they're fighting the British, and they even, like, they are British. And I think it's really amazing how they're showing such I don't even know, nationalistic diversity in their show. And it's always extremely refreshing to see a show that's explicitly not in Japan. Because even if they don't say they're in Japan, you always have, like, this assumption where it's like, this is Japan. It's like Death Parade, right? I believe it's just somewhere underground in Japan, there's just this bar where the people are just doing this. But it's like, they never say it, but it's like Death Parade. It's like, that's just in Japan. Like, that's just how I see it, right? Because we're never explicitly told otherwise, and everyone is from Japan. So it makes sense that these are people who are from Japan as well. This place must be in Japan. Even though it's like a non-existent entity that is nothingness, I guess, is like what they kind of denominate themselves as. But it's always interesting.
And like a purgatory place.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. Even like purgatory, right? It's like Angel Beats. I'm like, this high school is probably somewhere in Japan, is what I always thought, right? Where it's like,
I mean,
it's like until explicit. It is. No, I agree.
I mean, it's interesting because, I mean, we've gotten to the point where we just associate everything with Japan when it comes to anime. Like, I mean, you could go back to Berserk and go, that's probably somewhere in medieval Europe that's taking place, like, just from an architectural perspective. And I think that's kind of why older shows like Cowboy Bebop can be so memorable from its art designs, because you kind of get bored after a while of the girls wearing miniskirts all the time. They're always in their school uniforms. The buildings always kind of got this very Japanese look to them. I mean, it's no offense to them. Like, a lot of Western shows that apparently take place around the world always kind of look like Vancouver or LA.
Or New York.
Or somewhere along those lines. Or New York. Like,
right, well, and that's part of it, is that the architecture can sometimes give us the implication of where it is. So, like, we can see stories that don't take place in, quote-unquote Japan. Look at their buildings. Look at how they're structured. The things in them. All Japanese. So how could you not correlate that with Japan, then?
Yeah, and so there's a very interesting, like, association of just settings and Japan. Because it's the country of origin, so you assume it's derivative of that place. So it's always really interesting when it just throws you just a complete curveball, and it's like, this doesn't take place in Japan. And you're like, what is this then? Like, where are we? Like, I'm lost. Because you're just like, I don't get it. It's a place, but it's not Japan, so it must be somewhere else.
Yeah, like, good examples are like Psychopaths didn't really have very much Japan in it, you'd think.
Yeah.
I mean, you kind of still got the feeling, though, that it was Japan, but at the same time, there was really not that much Japanese architecture that I remember. Or like Wexter said...
There really wasn't, yeah.
Right. Or like what Wexter said is, like, with Berserk, there's, like, no Japanese architecture. It's all European. And you know it's not Japan.
Yeah, it's very medieval in its architecture and European. Similar to something like more recent, again, Seven Deadly Sins and Jukensen no Mare, both of them, being very medieval, you can tell by kind of just how the way things are structured. It doesn't look like very medieval Japan.
Right.
Or what we'd associate with medieval Japan, based on stuff or like previous experiences with stuff like Rurouni Kenshin or Nobunaga Concerto, where it's a very historical piece that the setting is a big deal because the people in the setting are an even bigger deal. Like the idea of Nobunaga and like who he was, and like the idea of the prefecture and the warring states period and everything, and how that all kind of interties is a big part of the Japanese history. So the setting plays a huge part in those historical pieces, like Sengoku Basara and stuff, stuff like that. And those sort of things, like the setting's always really interesting to me, especially when it's not in Japan explicitly. So that's why I mentioned Jukensen no Mare, though, is because it's like, this is in Japan. I'm like, whoa, it's fucking crazy, dude. I was like, whoa, you're not in Japan. What are you? Some kind of rebel?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's also why certain series like Spice and Wolf remain endearing even after 2 seasons, and people still demand a 3rd season, because it's so different. It's so not what you traditionally would associate with Japanese anime. Like, I mean, you've got some of it. You got some of the traditional Japanese anime tropes in there. The animal character.
Like, a fucking... I was gonna say, a fox girl.
Yeah.
Like, Neko Mimi is a very
but
big
at the same
indicator.
time, you kind of, when you watch it, you can kind of think it kind of does take place in Europe or somewhere in Western Asia or someplace like that, where it's very rooted in that kind of area, in that kind of time period. And I think that helps keep certain shows to remain endearing with the audience. It's just when they are that drastically different.
Yeah, I mean, like, that's so true.
It's not only that, but they also add other things in Spice and Wolf. Like, a good example is the paganism. What do you associate paganism with? Europe, right? Like, that's what you would think. You take history lessons, the paganism, the witch hunts, all that kind of stuff almost correlates with one another, and you kind of go to a almost European mindset, and that's just one of the small touches they threw on top of it, I think, to show that it was in a European-ish setting. Or the church's power is another example. Japan didn't really have a huge monarchical church that was, the power, the donations all go there. Sure, they had like Buddhism and what's the other one? Hinduism?
Shintoism.
Not so much
Shintoism, yeah.
Shintoism, that was it. But they didn't really have one giant church that was almost shaping society to a certain degree.
Yeah. And I mean, that's what also makes Spice and Wolf, I think, a great series entirely, is that it really... I think it speaks more to a Western audience to an extent than it does an Eastern audience, because we know more about the actual history of Europe, and so it makes that kind of setting more endearing to us as well. When talking about those shows that really differentiate themselves with their difference compared to the more modern tropes of anime, is you are noticing the strong resurgence of classic manga getting rebooted into anime.
Yeah.
You've got the Berserk movies, you've got JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and you've got Parasite, which is the most recent example.
It's interesting how that it is definitely more of a predominant thing in recent era. It's interesting. It's always really interesting to me whenever a manga goes under the radar for decades, and then all of a sudden just shoots up to popularity, and then gets something, or just doesn't get anything. The classic example that I always love bringing up is like really important older manga, something like Battle Royale, right? Where it's like, it's interesting how it has a very distinct manga that far surpasses, in my opinion, its live-action counterpart. But it's interesting that whenever manga are so popular and they remain just kind of there, like they don't get anything, like... It's really odd to me still that there is no vagabond anime, right? There's no... That doesn't exist. Even though it's been going on for 37 volumes. It's going on for 20 years now. And still no one's touched it. Like Blade of the Immortals is still a really good example.
I mean, it's a running joke within the Berserk fan base that we are never going to see anything past the Golden Age, aren't we? We're never going to see that animated. So I guess the day you do get a 4th movie will be the day, like, rejoice among certain manga fans as well. Because some series, especially older ones that did get an anime, and definitely see this with recent anime as well, is they just kind of stop on the read the manga ending, and that expression kind of annoys me to an extent, because there is the manga, there is the source material. You can go read that if you really want to know what happens next, but I can understand that frustration, because it's like, I love this anime, I want it to continue, and it just stops. And a lot of classics just have that, it's over.
Yeah. I think that's like, it's really crazy that that's happening. Like, it's still crazy to me to this day that there's no 20th Century Boys anime. Just because it's no Kurosawa, and I just don't get it. Like, it would be such a good anime. And then you have stuff, of course, like Oyasumi Punpun and the like. But it's always just really weird that they are kind of like, just, no, we're not going to do it. I mean, there's some other reasons, of course, like with something like Yotsuba, where it's like, the mangaka explicitly doesn't want an anime. He hates it, the idea of it, because of what they did to Azumanga Daioh whenever he made that. And he just hated it. He's like, I can't believe you do this to my stuff. And so he forbids the creation of an adaptation of Yotsuba because of it. Because he's like, no, fuck you guys. Like, I don't want you to doing this to my series again. And so he's put like a lock on it where no one can make anything from it. So now everyone loses. And but more often than not, it's not even that. It's usually just people they just don't do it. Like, they're just like, well, let's just not do it. Like, we have nothing to gain from making this anime. Why should we? And I think that's just like the crazy stuff. Because then you have like something like Yokohama Shopping Log, where it's a really like renowned series, and we'll probably never see an anime for it, and that's just kind of how it is. That said, we have been seeing a lot more anime adaptations in recent years, more so than original anime. It's more rare for a series to be in a totally original anime series now than it was in, say, like the early 2000s or like late 2000s, near like 06, 07, where there were so many original works. Like, I remember Mappa next season's releasing Punchline, and it's an original anime, and that's like, whoa, like I haven't seen one of those in a while. Like, the last original anime that was an original anime was like Zankyo no Terror or like Rage of Bahamut. But they're far outnumbered by adaptations of not even just manga, just light novels and games and whatnot. I think adaptations are definitely the predominant driving force, even though it wasn't always like that, but it has been. There always has been adaptations.
Well, I think now with the grab and trying to get anime produced and shoved out, it's so much easier to take from a source material, especially if it's a manga, where everything's almost done for you, I think. You just need to put it into animation. You know, the scenes, the perspectives, a lot of that is predetermined by the manga itself. Now, I don't know that much about animation, but I assume that plays a significant role than taking a visual novel and trying to have to build out a scene and then animate that scene.
Yeah, and so now I'm just going to be like, oh, as a person with an animation degree. So, as a person with an animation degree, yes, that's fairly true. An adaptation of a manga is much different than an adaptation of something that is not contextualized. For instance, a light novel, because you have nothing really to go on other than the predetermined character designs. Everything else, like all of the composition and framing and everything, is not up to you. It's up to usually a cinematographer. But when you're adapting a manga, you usually are like, this is very much so what we want to do. We might intersperse some original content to make it more flow better and make more sense contextually in our medium versus theirs. But a lot of it stays the same. Like, I think always a good example is if you bring up Bones. Bones is like really good at doing exactly frame for frame renditions of certain panels, where they will make an entire anime frame based off of a panel of its source material with the exact same composition. It's like they just traced it in anime form. And usually they do. And I think that's always just amazing, because Bones is just unbelievable at adapting things in that regard.
And even when they don't adapt one-to-one from the manga, you get something like Full Metal Alchemist 2003, where it even can be argued which one's better, 2003 or Brotherhood. Because they are just that great of a studio at knowing what to adapt, and when they don't have the source material, they know how to make something amazing and memorable.
I think it's, their ability to improvise is definitely one of their stronger suits as a studio. And I think that it's really interesting because we haven't Bones original anime recently. We've all been a lot of people have just been like, oh, I don't know about this stuff. Like, Bones original anime are pretty weird. And they are. They definitely are. You get shit like Space Dandy and Hitsukai no Chaika and stuff.
But sometimes you get something like a Razafon out of the deal where you go, that was pretty great. That was pretty great.
Yeah, or you'll get something like Erotica 7. Or just Darker Than Black. Like, it's really interesting what you can get with Bones as a studio. Just letting them be themselves, basically. Something else I'd like to just bring up and touch base on is something that I've been hearing a lot about, and I think you guys might have as well. And if not, I'd love to inform you. And that is something in regards to Devil's Legacy.
Oh, I've heard about this.
And so, Devil's Legacy, I'm not going to say anything on it just because of the context of what's happening. But I feel it important to inform people about what is happening. So there's recently a Kickstarter for a series or a film series, or something like that. It's an animated series made in production in cohorts with Toei Animation. And what they were going to do is they were going to make a series, and they wanted to get funding for it. They wanted, I believe, 200,000 euros. So quite a bit of money. Or 150,000, I think. Anyway, what happened was they were getting support from people, for instance, like Misty Carnexia and various other people. And what happened was that brought a lot of attention to them. Go figure. The biggest anime YouTuber talking about something gives it attention. What a surprise. Granted, all this attention was not well received. So what happened was people were commenting on the quality of the animation and everything, questioning the plot line that was the synopsis that was given to them, questioning just the overall qualifications of the people wanting to make this. They didn't necessarily trust them or know how to trust them based on the fact that they wanted so much money and had no credentials to show for why they deserve it. And so there was a lot of criticism. And I think criticism is the good word to describe all of this, all the problems that have been ensuing. So recently what had happened was when people have been criticizing this fan crowdfunded anime, what's been happening is that if they criticize it, the Devil's Legacy anime will actually respond directly to the people and try to get that stuff removed under copyright violations and laws and try to sue the person, which is quite a serious threat that you're trying to put a DMCA on people and just be like, no, like, we're just going to take this down because. And it's a really hotly debated issue, but I think what makes it so hard to talk about with people is that they're so often targeting Devil's Legacy, and if you target Devil's Legacy, it's so often that people are just getting shut down by them. Just their Tumblrs, their YouTube videos, their Twitter posts, their comments on the crowdfunding on Kickstarter as well. But it's a really big issue right now, and the reason I bring it up is because it's affecting a lot of people. A lot of people are making videos on stuff like that. Some names that come to mind are, for instance, a good man I know, Michael or Goat Jesus, made a video having some criticisms about it, and got his video taken down by them with the threatening of a lawsuit at his hands if he did not. Which is quite a serious claim, especially when considering that if you take it to court of law, this could potentially turn into a very pricey situation that could potentially financially ruin this man's life. So this has been a really sensitive issue. And I think that without going into my opinion of it, I think that it's really important to know of this, because the idea that crowdfunding is being a very common thing right now. Crowdfunding, of course, is a very big part of anime, but it's been going in such interesting directions recently. I don't know if you guys are aware, but there's of course a project that was originally made by asked funding by CIA, which is Creative Intelligence Agency, not the Central Bureau of Investigation Agency. The CIA, which was a studio, newly formed studio, at the helm was the director of Sword of the Stranger. And they were asking for $180,000 USD to create an anime pilot called Under the Dog.
Oh, I heard of that. I was really excited for that. Yeah.
And to create it, they wanted this much money, and they wanted to be at the helm of it. And then what happened recently, the most recent development, is that the crowdfunding of it, which it met its goal, it met it with colors, it's just passing. And what happened was, it ultimately CIA lost interest, and they dropped the entire company. And so what's happened is that there's a new company that stepped up to the plate and has now inherited the work called Kinema Citrus, known for the 2 animes that they've made so far are Black Bullet and Barakamon. And they have since inherited the project and will be in charge of animating it. But it's really just amazing that all of this kind of stuff with crowdfunding is going on. And even just last week, mangaka Rei Hiyori, which is the mangaka who wrote a very influential manga in its genre, which is Black Lagoon, who just got his 10th volume released in America. Rei Hiyori's comedy manga, or slice of life manga, which is very different than Black Lagoon, but still very good. I really like it. Just had a crowdfunding through a Japanese website, not Kickstarter, not Indiegogo, but a Japanese crowdfunding site, and met its goal of roughly about $140,000 in 10 days. And this is really big news, because this is something that we never thought would be animated unless it was privately funded, which is exactly what fans are able to do now when taking part in the direct funding of something a product that they want. And that's really amazing to me. I think it's really cool. I think it's really important to realize what kind of future this might hold for anime, right? And I say this because we've actually, there's a lot of anime that are sponsored by the West, something like Hellsing Ultimate, which, believe it or not, is heavily made by the outside funding in the West, as well as stuff like Big O. But there's so many opportunities that this allows to bring to anime, because, for instance, we could have an anime that we really want made or something, and we could fund it and have it made directly, and we would no longer be consumers; we would be producers. And I think that kind of just idea is really exciting to me as both a consumer and a producer potentially, and a creator, I guess, since it's my degree. Well, what I want to ask, so I posed this entire question and bring up all of these examples to ask you guys, what is your thoughts recently on the idea of crowdfunding anime? What do you think are the pros and cons? What are you guys' general thoughts on crowdfunding anime?
I think me and Brent might know more about this than I think Heavenly would, but we've seen a lot of Kickstarter games become a very big trend, and they're starting to become bigger and bigger risks out there, because there's been multiple games, like Mighty Number 9 was one that had to go for a second round. I remember there were a few guys who used to work, I think it was at Silicon, who wanted to make a continuation to Eternal Darkness. That one failed. I mean, it's a huge risk when looking at Kickstarter, because even if you invest the money and they succeed on reaching their goals, you never know if the project's going to succeed, so you're taking on now the risks of the producer. And I think as fans, we want it to happen. I think that's why a lot of this stuff gets funded. And I think there's also this huge risk of, if it fails, we're the ones out of our money now. We're never going to get the product we paid for. And I think that's the kind of risk that a lot of anime fans are now starting to understand themselves, because they've seen video games come up and fail in reaching their goals. And so they're seeing stuff like Devil's Legacy, where they aren't sure of the project, and so they aren't sure if they want to invest in it. Well, stuff like Under the Dog, and I think Little Witch Academia was another one, the one by Studio Trigger.
Little Witch Academia.
Where they're like, oh yeah, no, we're really excited. We're happy with the names that are on this project. We'll invest into it. And Under the Dog is another example of a project that could potentially fail, even though it was funded.
And I think that's what makes Under the Dog and Devil's Legacy so interesting to me. I bring up Devil's Legacy because it was the ending of the story is Devil's Legacy was pulled and it was canceled, despite having a pretty enormous amount of time remaining on to meet its quota. It still failed, and so this brings up a lot of interesting kind of questions as far as what kind of insurance does this give the producers. And I think that's kind of what's interesting. So I think the idea that as long as we are delivered a product, I'm willing to accept the risk of quality as long as there is the guarantee of production. Because I don't really care if something's bad or not. Because I'm losing at most usually like $10, $20 maybe. In the case of Under the Dog, I think I would lose like, I don't know, 60 I think is what I lost on that one. If it does lose it, right? But I'm willing to take that risk to try to advance the medium as a whole. Because the biggest difference is that I believe that this kind of funding is just like what anime needs to kind of just become that, to kind of just grow out of what it's in right now. To become this streamlined thing for the West. And that's why I'm really interested in it, is because there's so much possibility. Like, we just don't know what these people want to make. Because, I mean, yeah.
To jump into this whole situation with the Kickstarter, it's very complicated to begin with. But I think the core thing with it is that we need to have trust with the people that we're investing into. And I use the word investing very particularly because that is what it is. And a lot of people tend to forget that. You are not paying for a product. You are paying for the possibility of a product. In other words, you are investing in the potential of the project, which is a key factor. When I look at an investment, I look at who's behind the project. I look at what their credibility is. Do they have degrees? Where's their history? Have they worked on other studios? Have they worked on other anime before? Stuff like that. When I buy a product, I say, does it look cool? Does it look interesting? And am I going to get it? Usually when I buy a product, the answer is always yes. I'm always getting a product. When I do an investment, I'm not always getting a gain. I'm not always getting a return on that investment. But to jump back, not even that far, the primary thing we need is trust between the product producers and the investors. Because we don't have that, particularly with Under the Dog. I didn't even invest into it, so more so for people who invested into it, I felt slightly irritated that they proposed this project, built this project, showed off examples of this project, got money for this project, dropped it, and gave it to someone else.
Yeah, I mean,
something that I don't know what that company is capable of. Is that company going to be able to produce Under the Dog the same way that it was produced in the trailer? I mean, that's a core question that has to be asked.
And I think that's why people trust studios like Trigger more so than the guys who worked on Devil's Legacy or even Under the Dog, for example, is because they were one of the first ones, I think, that really pulled this off really well and showed us the possibilities of Kickstarter anime and Kickstarter studios, because I personally believe, like, after Little Witch Academia, it was easier for them to get stuff like Kill la Kill greenlit, because there was that trust.
That's not true. Okay, first off, raising my hand, that's wrong. Kill la Kill is already in production and almost done.
It was? Okay, cool. then I'm off there. But either way, I think that's the thing, though, is that they've shown they are a trusted studio. They have Kill la Kill under their belt. They have Little Witch Academia under their belt. Sorry about the Kill la Kill detail.
That's also wrong.
But I mean,
because Kill la Kill wasn't out yet when it was funding, but that's all right.
Well, I'm saying now. Why? They're trusted. They're trusted.
But they weren't
now.
when they made
They're
it. That's what makes
now.
it so interesting.
And they.
But didn't Trigger have a long history of animation?
Name one other anime by Trigger.
No. I don't know. I
don't know studios.
They haven't
studios.
made any. That's what
on,
makes it so interesting.
It was the people who were on board with Studio Trigger, is that they were looking at the people involved with this, and they were seeing names from Gynax, and they were going, okay, I trust these people with my money. This looks like a cool project I want to invest into. Looks good, and Trigger paid off. They went, okay, here's Little Witch Academia.
That's
it's
also
awesome.
wrong. But okay, so let me explain Little Witch Academia really quick, because I've written papers like on this exact process. Because
all right, I'll trust Holden on this.
Really okay. So Little Witch Academia, and this relates to Death Billiards and Death Parade directly, was a part of this thing called Anime Mirai, where the Japanese government will give a grant of $300,000, or roughly about $300,000 per studio, to make no more than 30 minutes of stuff. It's called the Anime Mirai, which is a part of the Japanese Association of Newcoming Animators. So what happens is the only requirement is it has to be made by new and upcoming animators at a certain studio. Each studio will get a certain allocational grant that allows them money to make whatever they want as long as it's under 30 minutes. And then those people make it. So what happened with Trigger was they got the grant. And for reference, the same year, what happened was Madhouse also got the grant, JC Staff also got the grant, and a company you guys haven't heard about, which is, I think, MX got the grant. It's another company. But what they did was that you take all 4 of those films when they're done and make a 2-hour movie of just 4 shorts, and that's it. So what happened was with that film in particular, which is Little Witch Academia, which was a newfound studio Trigger, which is the since defected members such as Hiroyuki Imaishi and Yo-Yo Shinari, they left Gainax a while ago, and then they made their own studio Trigger, which had made nothing at this point. It's very important to realize. They've made nothing. They're in production of Kill la Kill. There's a really good documentary I recommend watching if you're interested in more of this, which is Making of the Magic, which is a Little Witch Academia documentary. But what happened was, after making this with the government's grant, so not their own money, so this was no risk to them, right? They just had to deliver, and if they didn't deliver, then they would revoke the grant, and everything would be on their heads. All the money that they spent would be their own money. So they made Little Witch Academia, and they made it with the government's money, so they made it for free. And then what they did was they marketed that free version that they made it public, which is still free. They still haven't lost any money on this. They made it public so by putting it on their YouTube channel after the year of their contract had expired. After putting it on YouTube, they had a demo to show, which was the completed first film, which was Little Witch Academia. They showed that, and they said, we would love to make a sequel to this.
Okay.
And we would like your money to do so. And we've never made anything. We're a new studio. We have nothing to show, but we can show you the exact thing that you'd be making a sequel to, and that's why it's a little different. Because they still hadn't made anything at the time, so it's more akin to something like the Eternal Darkness sequel, right? Where it's like this is like, okay, it's a sequel to Eternal Darkness. We know what we're getting. We know what it's based off of. We know the people trying to make this, right? It's the same kind of story with this, where it's like, okay, so it's going to be the same exact everything, same studio, same people, same animators, same director, Yoshinari, still story-wise by Hiroyuki Imaishi, same everything. The only thing is that we need your money to make this because we didn't even use our money to make the first one. We used a government grant to do so. So we need your help to make more. And so that's why it's kind of a little different, right? I do agree that it's really... in the terms of Under the Dog, it's different because you have to question whether the studio can do it. Of course, I think that they can totally do it because Kinema Citrus is a fantastic studio. They made Barakamon and Black Bullet, which, if nothing else, are beautiful looking shows. Considering that it's their first attempt, I think it's a really big thing to realize is that these aren't like they're not even rich. like they're just a new studio that was kind of like a subsidiary at first, and now they're just their own full-fledged studio, which is fantastic. Kind of like, but not like Mappa, right? Mappa had a lot of production money or producers going into it, and that's why they could make really high-end, slick stuff like Zankyou no Terror and stuff like Shingeki no Bahamut and stuff like, God, what was the one? Garo, yeah, Garo. But they can make all these really high-end stuff because they have a lot of money to do so, whereas someone like CIA, which didn't have any, they really needed the crowdfunding. So that's why it's so like weird and interesting, because it's a way of, it is all about trust, right? But I think that the way that people could, what I would love to see, what I think would be really interesting, would be to see a crowdfunded sequel to something.
That would be great.
I think that would be really interesting because people would have a pretense to work off of, right? It's easy to read a synopsis, I guess is what I'm trying to say, and be like, this sounds like a good idea. Like, this reads really well. But what does this, like, what does any of this look like? Like, what is this, how does this affect me, right? Do I even like any of this, right? Whereas with something that's pre-existing, it's like, oh, I would like more Ao no Exorcist. Yes.
And I mean, if we were to go back, and I mean, that's generally the idea of, is that you've got to have almost like a trusted group of people who are working on the project, people that you know from other projects and what you trust. Like, I think Shovel Knight was a good example of that. True. It was by a team of people that were formerly of I can't remember the exact studio name, that worked on Shantae. Yes. And they Way Forward, thank you. Yeah, and they were basically just saying, we got this idea. It's a video game called Shovel Knight. This is generally what it's going to look like. Here's our ideas for it. And they delivered. They started relatively small. A retro game, retro-styled, very basic. Well, Shovel Knight's a great game. Like, calling it basic is kind of an insult almost, but you get the idea. But I mean, when we look at these animation companies, And we look at these projects, and I think on one level, when we see a project that's very complex with lots of moving parts, like Under the Dog, we're just so badly want to throw our money at it because it looks so awesome that we sometimes almost forget how expensive anime actually is and how ambitious that project was. Like, it looked ambitious, like extremely ambitious. And I think that's why it makes it slightly more disappointing. And I think that kind of soured a lot of people going into Devil's Legacy. They were looking at the project, and they saw no names of people they were familiar with, and they weren't entirely sure if they could trust the studio. Like, some of the ideas are like, seems kind of neat, but I don't know. I've been burned before by people I trust more.
Yeah, and so, like, that's kind of, like, the dilemma of that right now. I still think crowdfunding is, in my opinion, the future of anime.
Yeah.
I say this because just, like, I think the niche will have to become self-sustaining in some way in this kind of digital age. Because I think physical sales of shows will drop dramatically in the next coming, like, half decade, 5 years. To the point where I think that we will have to step in as producers or risk losing our medium entirely.
Yeah, and I very much so agree with you that I do also believe crowdfunding is the future as well. But I think on some level, almost the people who are asking for the money from crowdfunding also have to realize what kind of came before, and they have to assure the people who are investing into it more confidence than they did before. Because at this point, thanks to the game industry, thanks to some of these failed anime projects that did get crowdfunded, people are more nervous and a little bit more wary with their money. So producers almost have to bring their A game, even from the pitch standpoint. They have to hammer it home so hard of, we are committed to this project 100%. We are going to try our absolute best to get through. If it fails, it fails, but it was not due to a lack of trying.
And like Webster said, there is a partial... I don't know that this is going to be the full future of anime. I really don't, because I see other things going around. For example, I see animes getting dubbed much faster than previously. I'm seeing dubs come out for series that are currently airing in Japan. That's something we never saw before. That's, something new. At least I think it is, as far as I know it is. And that's one thing. And the crowdfunding community the crowdfunding, what would I call it? Project idea could potentially hold the future of anime, but it's up to the early on producers, the people that are doing stuff right now, to decide whether it will or not. Because the more times people get burned, I'm not saying that there's a ton of examples of people getting burned, but the more times people get burned, the less and less likely it is that that's going to take hold of the future. We're going to need a strong connection and trust with the producers now more than ever in order to fully decide that. And if it is the future of anime, then that's amazing, because series that we do not see a second season to could potentially have a second season. Black Lagoon, where is the third season of Black Lagoon? Everyone loves Black Lagoon. If Black Lagoon had a Kickstarter for a third season, I'm sure people would buy into it. And that's what the future of Kickstarter holds, or not necessarily Kickstarter, but crowdfunding holds for, that kind of anime stuff. A sequel to particular series, as you said, rather than just the possibility of another anime being produced. Mm-hmm. You get to kind of pick and choose what you want to see.
Yeah, and so that's the beauty of being an anime fan in the 21st century. Do I think everything will go to this? I don't think so. Am I willing to throw my money at any of it? Absolutely. I got enough money to give away. Do I think it will happen very soon? Absolutely. Will this anime stop being made until then? No, there's no way. Anime just has too much money right now to just not do it. It's good. It's pretty hard. It's kind of like $140K an episode. It's pretty big. It's a lot of money to make every week and just throw at a wall and spend 6 months animating. But it happens a lot. So I don't foresee it changing anytime soon in the idea that it's stopping. I'm just saying it could. So don't mean to worry anyone watching. Anime is still here for a while, or at least as long as I'm part of the industry. Once I leave, it's pretty much done. But until then, I just want to thank you guys for watching Homecast. So I was here today with Wexter. Thank you so much.
Yo.
And my boy Heavenly. Thank you so much, dude.
Hello.
Yeah, and I don't know if Brent is still here, but I think he might be.
I am here. Yeah.
Welcome back. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And I'm Holden from Holden Reviews. Thank you guys so much for letting me be your guest star here today. It's been a lot of fun, and I hope to hear back from everyone some other time. But until then, I will sayonara and see you later.